Hello, and welcome to today's Praxist Table Talk. My name is Vincent, I'm the founder of Praxia, and today we're going to be discussing existentialism and knowledge. And joining me, I have a very important member of our leadership, Cody.
Hello, everyone, once again.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. This last episode was an undertaking in and of itself, but this one's definitely similar in a different way, if that made sense.
Yeah, it makes sense, especially because this one is kind of the same idea, but in a different, kind of abstracting the myths and the stories, whereas last episode we were kind of focused on the significance of the narratives that we have. Now we're focusing on the significance of the idea behind the narrative. You know what I mean? So it's a little bit different, but it's good to hear that you're doing well. But yeah, today we will be discussing, as I said, the topic of existentialism, and knowledge. There's a lot of different avenues to go down there. So we'll be discussing everything from the idea of the monad and a holistic understanding of reality, expanding upon how that kind of relates to the pillars of Praxism, which we will be getting into as well, to exploring how the pillars themselves become manifested in practice in our daily lives and embodied by more active types of ideas. And we may also detail the ideas of, things like the macrocosm and microcosm, different theories of reality and modern science, and how sometimes science substantiates more philosophic ideas and sometimes differentiates itself from it. And we'll also be discussing different types of knowledge and understandings of the world, very interesting stuff, as well as how we ourselves can interpret this and become better versions of ourselves in practice, if that makes sense. So do you have any opening statements before we, take it away?
Not really, no. I think it'd be better just to flow in each topic and be it more of a surprise.
All right, well, that sounds like it would be interesting as well. So the first topic we have today, or I guess the overarching theme, is the idea of a monistic and holistic understanding of reality. Actually, I think it would be best if I outlined the pillars of Praxism while I did this, because we kind of have it set out that there are 6 fundamental components to the idea of what we call Praxism, both philosophically as a kind of essential principle and more practical as we consider Praxism a type of method through which a principle becomes actualized. So we do have these 6 pillars, and I'll read them. They are as follows, as soon as I can pull them up. Or here they are. We have number 1, the monad. So, like I was saying before, we have this idea of a oneness to the universe, which I'll be getting into. It's essentially the monad is considered not in the this isn't like the Gnostic religious sect interpretation of the monad as like a superior variant to the demiurge. It's more so a perennial understanding of like the one, what Greeks would call the one, or what the Egyptians considered as being like the source and vitality of reality. Like pretty much what everything considers to be the source of and vitality of reality, as well as reality itself, as well as the source of every type of principle and certain ideas within reality as well. It's the source and substance of reality. And so
kind of like the Hindu conception of the Brahma, right?
Yeah, the Hindu conception of the Brahma. Even the Christian conception of God. I'll probably be getting into Meister Eckhart a little bit later and talking about how he interprets God, because he makes a very bold statement and claims that God is nothing, but he means it in the fact that God is no thing. But also in the fact that God is everything, and it's kind of the way in which this monad contrasts within itself. So that's pillar number 1, and then pillar number 2, we have the truth, and it is this idea of a quintessential truth. It is kind of the passive characteristic, or it's the kind of the passive operation by which the monad operates within itself, if that makes sense. It's the rules by which the monad operates within itself. That would be the quintessential truth. And then this truth becomes translated into other areas, other spheres of reality, kind of like a a downward descent into various degrees of relativity. And this will probably all make sense later as I get a little bit more of a chance to explain it. The third pillar, we have the propriety. So the quintessential truth kind of denotes the quality of propriety to be embodied by all principles and components within all degrees of reality. So what this means is that every principle has a proper form, and this form is denoted or understood as being an alignment with the quintessential truth. And so it is possible, due to relativity, for a principle to not be proper, to not have a proper formulation to it. It is possible for a principle to be improper. But for Praxism, we tend to espouse propriety, and various religions have this as well. Castes are a good example of spiritual propriety. We have like a proper ordering to functions within society, like religion, politic, economic, kind of like how we talked about with the idea of economic ideology. But this is the idea of propriety, is that there is a proper ordering that the quintessential truth gives upon each principle. And then number 4, for the fourth pillar, we have translations. And so a translation would be best described as transposing one piece of a more holistic principle into another sphere, which then that piece becomes its own principle in relation to the sphere. So consider it like we have the quintessential truth becomes translated into a personal principle by which you live by. That is a holistic principle in itself, but it is one part of the truth. And so that is the way the truth becomes translated into or superimposed onto a lesser and more relative principle. And then as the fifth pillar, the fifth component of Praxism, we have the alignment. Now, the alignment is something that we have, as reality kind of goes into itself, as it is kind of understood, there are various degrees to the monad or the monistic reality. As the monad kind of, or as reality kind of descends in degrees, you get a little bit more relativity. You get the option for relativity. That's where choice comes in. That's kind of like where the argument between fate and choice kind of comes in as well, which we very well could get into either here or in another episode. I feel like fate and choice is kind of an interesting topic to talk about, but it's because of relativity that there is this idea of choice. And so there's obviously a relative aspect to the capability of a certain principle in a lesser sphere of reality, if that makes sense. And so the alignment principle, the alignment component, would be if a principle spontaneously aligns with a continuity that originates from the lower and more relative degree with a more absolute higher and quintessential degree. So it's a way in which a principle spontaneously aligns from within to the quintessential truth, if that makes sense. And then as the sixth pillar, we have the actualization or the manifestation, which is kind of the end goal of Praxism. It's like Praxism in action, if that makes sense. So we have, on the one hand, we have a holistic understanding of reality as a monad, as one entity, and then we have a holistic understanding of reality as various components working together as the manifestation or the actualization there. And so these are the pillars which kind of reflect Praxism as a conception for us, but it also reflects a whole bunch of other, like these are the pillars which can be found within every religious conception, every spiritual conception, every, not even just religious or spiritual, but every philosophic conception that kind of ties into these more metaphysical ideas, every philosopher's system who, while they may be different in the way in which they are considered to operate, like Heideggerian metaphysics might be different than Evolian metaphysics, might be different than Guénonian metaphysics, and so on, might be different from each other, they still have these fundamental principles within them. These principles can be found within each of them. So these are the perennial ideas of Praxism, and then also the method through which these principles become actualized themselves. So it's a bit of a difficult grasp, but the importance here is the idea of the monad and a holistic understanding of reality. So I guess the best way I could put it in, like to translate into like more layman's terms, is that for reality to exist, it has to exist somewhere. And that somewhere is kind of beyond our understanding. It is kind of reality existing within itself. And then that means there must be a more outer shell to it, if that makes sense. There needs to be a various degrees to it. And so as these degrees ascend into more absolute, more principled and more essential degrees, you get reality kind of existing not in a 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional area, but in like kind of a 1-dimensional area. That's this idea of the monad, is the first dimension, or the way in which reality is holistically embodied within itself. And so that's why it's monism and holism, because you have the idea of an essential one, and then that one is interpreted as the whole. It's these very broad philosophic concepts that kind of are at play here. And so the importance of all this is to understand that there is not just it's to understand that everything has a specific position or a specific function that it must play. It's a way in which we view dichotomies as well. I might get into dichotomies later on too, but it's the way in which we view dichotomies, where it's not one or the other, but one and the other, but in what order. It's that kind of idea. Do you have anything to add, by the way, before I move on a little bit from here?
No, I just that last bit you had with the monistic conception and having these frames of reality, it got a little bit into the Hegelian conception of like idealism. And when we speak about these things, they're multifaceted. We're not just taking one conception of the world or philosophic perspective over another. It's sort of like a hodgepodge of everything that these philosophies get right. And the Hegelian model of the conception of the world existing entirely in one's own mind, one's mind's vision of it, that kind of translates from the pure Platonic form or Aristotelian form as it exists. That is one level to this, whereas on the individual aspect of things, but on the grand concept of the entire world or the existence itself, beyond just what exists outside of the individual, which was where the idealism fails, because it's assuming that nothing does exist except for your own mind's eye. Right. I might be butchering that a little bit, but just for simplistic terms, we're getting to the point where there does exist some sort of objective reality, not just on a physical sense, but on a more metaphysical aspect as well, that leans into those individual aspects of one's own nature as well. And we'll be touching on both going across this episode.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And, what you touched upon very, very much does correspond to the way in which metaphysics is interpreted or kind of characterized. I heard a quote, I can't remember who said it, but it was something like quintessential metaphysics and quintessential, I guess what we would call praxism, can't be holistically described or characterized, because any description is kind of pigeonholing it into a box that doesn't necessarily examine the whole picture. So we can describe these various elements, but that's the best that we can do. We can't describe the full picture, if that makes sense. You know what I mean?
It's lowering the resolution of the actual image.
Exactly. But this idea of the monad comes in various forms. We have it in everything from Christianity, most obviously with, monotheism, like Zoroastrianism, Judaism, the Abrahamic religions, all of the monotheistic religions are very much embodiments of the monad. But even in dualistic or even pantheistic religions have this idea of a emanationist type of understanding. So there's a spectrum of cosmogonies, right? There's one that believes in theism, and there's another one that believes in organicism, in a sense that theism is that there is a conscious effort to reality. And you could say that theism kind of describes the creation process as being part of a conscious plan, in the sense that This is a pre-planned event by a conscious or superconscious entity, and that the various stages of creation or the various degrees of reality exist as part of a superconscious plan. And then organicism kind of understands these emanations or creations or creative events as proceedings from a primordial source. While still having a sense of order to them, they do proceed kind of in a manner that is, like as the name suggests, that is organic. It is not, it still is, it's not evolutionary, it's not evolutionism, it is still creationism, but it's not a theistic or conscious understanding of creationism. It's more of a, like I said, an organicist understanding. It's an understanding that relates back to the idea of a preconscious effort or preconscious creation of reality. And so these two ideas sit on either end of a spectrum, and the commonality between them is not so much, well, I guess the differentiation between them is not so much as is the differentiation between this spectrum itself and other lesser understandings of reality, other more relative understandings. And so when we look at Praxism and we look at the idea of the monad, Praxism wouldn't have a position on this spectrum, but it would be the spectrum. It would kind of be an understanding of the spectrum itself, and then understanding what these various components play. But various cosmogonies can be found on this spectrum, like I said, one end of which relates to theism and the other to organicism. And they play in various ways into an understanding of reality. So like I said, you have the more Christianized religions, the more Abrahamic religions, understanding it as a theistic interpretation, and then you have emanationist religions or pagan religions who would understand it as kind of organicist in a way in which there is still a conscious effort by maybe a certain set of gods or a certain pantheon, but that this effort isn't the beginning of creation. It's just a substantial part of creation, if that makes sense. So these are two various sides of a spectrum on which different cosmogonies can be placed.
All right. And that, just as an aside, it's just a pet peeve of mine, always placing things on a spectrum. Nothing wrong with how you're describing things so the audience can understand it. But when we get into these philosophical, pseudo-political sorts of positionings, it's always destructive to the point to one-dimensionalize them quite literally on this sliding scale, and how the scientism of today has kind of done that to many material things. And I always see things as a three-dimensional space on where you can position yourself given a certain topic for all various topics, whether that be some political stance or policy stance or what so have you, but also bringing in the temporal aspect of things too, where all of these ideas can be exactly the same, but given their own different space in time, they change radically in how they're perceived and how they're dealt with too. So keep that in mind for the more envisioning of things when we're getting into concepts, very fourth dimensional type of mental imagery.
Yeah, that makes sense. I do understand your pet peeve with it as well. And it was kind of difficult for me to abstract the more modernistic conceptions of like spectrums and ranges and stuff like that when speaking of these concepts myself, because you are correct. There is a way of trying to make everything a gradient. You know what I mean? There's a way of trying to make everything interchangeable. But that's not what I'm trying to do with this. I'm trying to present things as more of an understanding that there is a wider body of that there's a wider area in which various things that are pinpoints or specificities can be placed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and It is just the simplest way of trying to categorize things. It's that black and white, good or evil type of distinction. And since we are talking about existentialism, or getting into that now, moving away from the monad, beyond good and evil and Nietzsche might be brought up from time.
Yeah, it is a good segue too, because the reason I bring up this monad in the first place, or this holistic understanding of reality in the first place, is because this is the mindset that I feel like we have to espouse as Praxis, right? Like as Praxis, we are kind of perennialists by looking at various philosophic concepts and ideas and various even religious and spiritual conceptions or political conceptions or social ideas and things like that, and finding within them the various pieces that abstract and come back to the philosophy of Praxism. So, as we look at these various philosophers, as we look at these various even different types of knowledge and different ideas of how existence works within itself, this is the idea, or this is the mindset with which we need to approach these things as more holistically oriented. You know what I mean?
Oh, sorry. I wasn't close enough to my mic. Absolutely.
No, you're good. But yeah, so I guess, so you mentioned earlier that, I can't remember which one it was that you said it was Hegel, right? Who had the idea of, of reality existing only within one's head.
Well, he's like the biggest player in idealism, but that was kind of his conception. Again, slightly butchering it, with tangential note there. Looking back on some of our episodes and editing things and whatnot, we do get details wrong from time to time, so don't take everything we say as gospel or factual.
Yeah,
we slip up here and there. We try to be good on it, but considering the length and depth of these concepts and episodes, it's hard to get things exactly right, especially on the fly, or not on the fly. We do research quite a bit ahead of time, but just in case we do get something wrong or something you may not know, fact check us, air quote, more or less, just to make sure that we're being held to a higher standard and you're not being misled either.
Yeah. The concepts
going back into it.
Yeah, the concepts that we try to, we get at the concept, but there might be like minor details that we mess up. So that definitely is something that happens. But the reason that I ask is because that kind of corresponds to this idea of, so a few philosophers, like it's kind of like this general understood idea in the realm of like consciousness and conversations surrounding that idea is there's this idea that the monad that we were talking about, this monistic reality, kind of works in the same way that consciousness works, or that a human mind works. Kind of like in the various degrees of relativity, like I was explaining earlier. You have this idea of reality existing within itself, kind of in the same way that the mind exists within itself. And the various spheres of relativity, the various degrees of relativity that you encounter as you dive deeper into reality, as you go closer to the center, closer to the core. This would be kind of akin to the various relative thoughts that you have that you cannot control, the various aspects within your mind that pop up almost out of your control, almost at random at times. And that's where the idea of relativity kind of corresponds. And so the idea of the macrocosm and the microcosm is very much like reality existing as a mind, maybe not in one person's mind, but as a mind, or as a human or conscious system itself,
Yeah, that's a bit heavy to kind of get around in this as well. What specifically were you trying to get at with that as a mind in and of itself?
What do you mean?
Like I was following you along there for a second.
Oh, okay.
I just didn't know where you were trying to guide the point.
Oh no, that's just what you were saying with Hegel ties back to that, and how reality has been considered in various circles to work in the same way that a mind would work. And so there's this idea of a microcosm and a macrocosm, within which humans kind of themselves embody this idea of reality existing within itself in the same way, in the same type of, in the same dimensions.
Oh, okay.
Almost. There's this idea that reality is kind of superconscious. It's not unconscious or subconscious, but it has a conscious element to it. Kind of like how I was talking about with the theistic side of cosmogonies and stuff like that. But
yeah,
almost,
I was just thinking that might get into the concept of things like God.
Yeah, almost in a different way though. It's funny because like as we're talking about like existentialism and stuff like that, it very much does kind of correspond to the idea of existence and the questioning of reality and the questioning of what is existence and what I guess you could say what embodies or what is embodied by existence and what kind of corresponds or what counts as existence, what counts as counter existence as well. I brought up Meister Eckhart earlier because he was a good example of teaching that God is no thing, and that kind of counteracts existence. It's almost in the sense saying that God does not exist because he exists everywhere, or because he exists outside of things that are. You know what I'm saying? So
yeah, it's kind of the inverse almost of that that macrocosm microcosm like you were saying, and whereas it's something that there's a well-defined space of existence of itself, and then there's the mind within that exists within its own parameters.
Yeah.
But then there's these forces or force outside of that bubble or realm, as you may put it, that is independent of it entirely, or may how to say, not interweave in a way, or I'm getting back to the fourth dimensional aspect of things, like I brought up with the political spectrums and whatnot, but much more to the actual theoretical physics of it. And I'm struggling with the words at the moment. It's almost like a cross section colliding with each other in space and time, and it's these forces that we're getting at to the root of existence itself and the driving forces thereof.
Right.
Where there's the own self-contained system, this entropic system that we have and can observe and interact with, and then there's something that exists outside of that is, in all conception, nothing, but not because it's nothing, it's because it's no thing that we can physically ever really conceive of.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why I brought up the idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm. It's because in the same way that existence exists within itself, to what degree do you exist within yourself? To what degree does one exist within the confines of their own mind? And over
what degree do you actually have free will?
Exactly. Things like that. And so I feel like that kind of corresponds to what you're saying about Hegel, just kind of like as a segue into talking about each of these philosophers and their worldviews and things like that.
I didn't even think that was a segue. That was a whole topic in and of itself, but thank you. That got my mind working in a few different ways as well. Going on that aspect of how much of your own mind exists within itself and how independent you are as a person, at least on a psychological level, that there's a few different ways of going about it, and that's what gets into the existential form of things. There's the subjective realm, which is how existentialism came to be in the first place, with psychologists like Jung and Freud kind of tackling things, which then, they're the more objective type of things. Sorry, with thinkers like Dostoevsky or Nietzsche and some others. I'm trying to Heidegger, And
I
a
agree. Yeah.
few people like that have tried getting onto the um, how to in dealing with existence itself deprived of any further meaning or interaction with a higher purpose, for a sense, especially in Nietzsche, because he was so fervent in this God is dead and we've killed him type of mentality, and trying to work his entire life and making a system where you could still find purpose and meaning in life beyond just that higher ideal of an existence beyond our realm, this encapsulated realm that we have. Um, and then on the objective side of things, it's like I mentioned, the Jung's versus Freud's, and then leading into people like Bernays, which goes down the more Freudian school of things. And Bernays is a very interesting person in and of himself as well, and how he deals in with propaganda and um, how the current fourth estate media is structured as we know it today.
Yeah.
Um, but also, excuse me. But also with the extent to how much you actually act of your own volition and how much you're being manipulated into doing things that other people want you to do, or that your lower level instincts are guiding you to do beyond what you may consciously think you're doing of your own free will, if that makes sense.
Yeah, what you're talking about kind of reminds me of Heidegger's subject of Dasein, I believe it's pronounced, Dasein, and it's this idea of being there. That's what it means. By, in a sense, existing in a certain time and place. So you know how, the sort of idea of I think, therefore I am. This is kind of I've seen a lot of people say that it's a rejection of it. I feel like it's more so of a development of this I think, therefore I am thing. It's this idea of an inseparability between what is objective and what is subjective. And in the sense that you are kind of, I guess we were talking about how, like, a person exists within their own mind. It's this kind of existence within the world as well. It's an experiential understanding of the world, kind of in the sense that a person is inseparable from the world. Kind of like I guess the best way to describe it is, I talked earlier about translations and transpositions of certain things, and in the way in which everything within existence is a translation or a transposition of some type of the monad, humanity is no exception to that. We are individuals in as far as we can differentiate ourselves from another person, but to what degree do we derive from the same thing? To what degree do we hold the same objective standpoint within the world, ontologically? You know what I mean? And so that kind of reminds me of what you were talking about.
That actually gets into a lecture by Jordan Peterson that I was watching in preparation for this video, and he brought up the example of a young child, and you take a young child with their parents and go into like a crowded mall or shopping center or something of that sort, and tell the child to stay where they're standing and have the parent walk away. And after enough distance, if the child can't see their parent anymore, they start freaking out and crying, and that detachment from their center of not just comfort but security and sustenance thereof is a moment of existential dread for them, because now the thing they are dependent on in which to live, their parent, their caretaker, so on, has disappeared, and now they're in a perceivably hostile environment, even if everyone around them might want to help the child, but because it's unfamiliar, or because they don't have that structure around them on which they're used to, this singularity comes about within the mind of a child, and then bring that out further, the mind of any individual person sees yourself as being individualist only to a certain extent. And that's where a a lot of the difficulty comes with the liberal conceptions of the world on individuality itself, because any man is deserving of the fruits of his own labor, so to speak, and his own ability is free will or a praxis thereof. But he can't be completely detached from civilization or reality entirely without being, like we mentioned in the, I forget which episode it was now, but we mentioned that with Plato, and I always get confused with the three of them. One of them that was saying that a man who can do such is either a beast or a demigod thereof.
Yeah.
And then that kind of plays into the same concept again.
Yeah, and you bring up the idea of existential dread, and it's kind of the same thing that people experience as soon as they are thrown out of their comfort zone. You know what I mean? It's this understanding that you are part of something. You are part of reality. A lot of times existential dread is felt in times of war,
Yeah, not just part of reality, but your local reality, your time and space in existence.
Yeah, exactly. So like the idea of a kid in a shopping mall, who loses his mom, it's kind of the same idea as, a person who might have their house bombed and now they have no house. It's the same type of concept.
Or even broader on a societal level. A whole generation of young men that have the ability to make themselves into proper men in society being stripped away from them, both on a financial or on a sexual level. And we see that ever-growing concern now with especially Zoomers, but I think most so millennials being probably the most psychologically damaged in this aspect.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes from a hyper-individuality and an understanding of Nietzsche's nihilism that doesn't actually result from any of Nietzsche's other philosophies. You know what I mean? It's a lot of existential dread that is being propped up by various other forces, if that makes sense. But kind of moving on from that, there's this idea of being. I kind of want to go back to Dasein or Dasein, however it would be pronounced. I've actually never heard that word pronounced, but regardless, being and time was the not the magnum opus of Heidegger, but was one of his more famous works, more well-known works, and he discusses this idea of being within the world and existence and things like that. And here we go. Let me see. Okay, yeah, here we go. So there's this idea of being in the world in relation to time, and he believes that time finds its meaning in death. That's a quote unquote from an author named Michael Kelly. But that he basically, time is understood as finite. Existence is understood in a linear perspective of being front and back, and time is considered as being finite. And this kind of contrasts with the idea of a cyclical time that we were talking about before. Kind of how the various world's religions and ancient conceptions and things like that have this idea of the doctrine of the ages. There's this idea now, which is kind of refuted by Heidegger's work, but is very well described in this section of his writing here, in which a man considers himself as one part of a specific time, but serving no purpose. You know what you get what I'm getting at?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, the reason I bring this up is because I kind of wanted to go back and detail an idea of, kind of a degree of relativity to, a holistic reality in relation to time and being.
If I may assist you on that, there's actually a quote from Pascal that Peterson uses in his lecture that perfectly describes what you're getting at now.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So this is from Thoughts of Pascal. Quote, when I consider the brief span of my life, swallowed up in the eternity before and even behind it, the small space that I fill or even see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces which I know not and which know not me, I am afraid and wonder to see myself where rather than there. For there is no reason why I should be here rather than there, now rather than then. Unquote.
Exactly. That's a good quote. That's a good quote that embodies the idea that what I'm talking about here. And it's this idea of purposelessness, or of being a small fish in a large ocean, that I feel like derives all meaning from quote unquote existence as it is understood today by various measures and metrics. You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
I guess the reason I bring this up is because I wanted to detail this idea of cyclic time and passive time in a different light. There's this idea in Christianity that time is linear, and so you have the creation on one end, and you have on the other end you have Armageddon, or the end, right? So there's a beginning and there's an end to the Christian understanding of time. And then in a more scientific understanding, you have this idea of again, forward and backward. It's linear, but in a different sense. It's less philosophic and it's more functional. But with the scientific sense, you can kind of bend time. You can understand that time is a little bit less. It's not as linear as a individual might experience it as. You know what I mean? You can kind of bend it with various forces like gravity and things like that. So there's a scientific understanding of time, which kind of corresponds to the idea of cyclic time, and how things like the like Hindu and all of these other religions have this idea of the yugas and the ages and things like that. And that's one of the things I wanted to get into when it comes to time, because there are, as I was saying before, there are various degrees to reality, and then one of those degrees is the part of which there is a beginning but no end, and then there is a beginning and an end, and then there is no beginning and no end. And so I guess the best way to describe it would be to denote within the various degrees there is a set of beginnings from outwards in the same way that we talked about emanationism and creationism and even organicism and things like that. It can kind of be discerned by observing these various systems, that whatever you want to call it, whether you call it a sphere or a bubble or a realm or whatever it may be, the monad kind of formed itself by going from the outside in the same way that it formed itself from objectivity to relativity. And then within the relative spheres, things were formed, going on and on. So there's this idea of multiple beginnings, but only one end. And I bring up these various understandings of time because they do correspond to different degrees of reality. So we have this idea of the monad as a quintessential reality, as the all of reality. And then, it's the principle of everything, the highest level of existence. The parameters, and the parameters of this exist, like within the parameters of this exist supernaturalities, naturalities, subnaturalities, all of this other stuff. And this is, synonymous with other expressions, all used to denote the highest mode of being, which is the quote-unquote non-manifest absolute principle. And then this would be in the degree of beyond being, or it would be above being. And this is eternal, in a sense, with a capital E. This is a time that never began and a time that will never end. It's difficult for humanity to wrap its mind around, but this is the idea of the monad and time, and being and time in the highest degree as can be understood by a few philosophers out there, which we're kind of
or a
getting
few
into.
physicists.
Yeah, even physicists, yeah, which we're kind of getting into. The scope of this idea is everything, including nothing. And so this is the kind of eternal and timeless principle in and of itself. And then that would be considered, in an active form, it would be considered the monad existing within itself. And so there's the second mode of being, quote unquote, which is the idea of the idea of reality in relation to itself. And so this is kind of an aeonic and a metacosmic time, which has a beginning but has no end. And so you can see that this second degree began within the monad. It began almost, if you picture a circle with a line through it. Picture a line beginning on the left side as it goes into the circle. The line indicates various beginnings, and once it reaches the middle, it indicates an end. And so this aeonic time, this second degree, has a beginning but no end. And so, we go on to the various modes of existence, and the various modes of form and substance and things like that. And we get into temporality and things like that. And this is where we get into this idea of the cycle of the ages. And so when it comes to the world, or when it comes to humanity or things like that, the cycle of the ages is understood to be a cyclic time that had a beginning, has an end, and then has a beginning again, and kind of rolls over itself in a revolutionary fashion. And then within this time, there are various other times. And this is where you get the idea of a time that has a beginning and has an end, like a lifespan. And it's very difficult when you try to describe this concept, because
almost like the Russian nesting dolls of meta reality.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting to note that even time as it is perceived by man is different than time as it is perceived by other beings. For example, there's the idea in Norse mythology, I believe it is, that 1 year for man corresponds to, 1 year for a god corresponds to 1,000 years of man, or something like that. It's this idea of time being understood in the realm of subjectivity. So you have,
even when you look at how time is represented or understood across men itself, whether you have different populations with different median IQs or different cultural conceptions of how time is perceived, planned for, and reacted to, there's a lot of not just interchangeability, so that obviously we can communicate across intelligence and culture, but there's a lot of distinctness in how each of those uniquely identify with something as abstract as time itself. And it's and that's all within our own relative experience as a species.
Yeah, it is. And there's also the quality of time that goes around, that comes about with aging, and the experience of time as it progresses throughout a person's lifespan, or throughout a subjective perception of time. You know what I mean? So like you have, on the one hand, a little kid who might experience a day which feels like a week to the kid, because that's all he's experienced. And so there's this idea that time quickens as you get older, or the more experience you have, the less you experience each second. It's an interesting concept to get into.
I've had a theory about that ever since I was just a little kid too, which is, I don't know, I've always been this weirdo that's thought about very high concepts always impressing adults and things like that. But getting into it is, I think, with that conception of a child thinking like a day is a week, not literally, but in its essence, how it's subjectively experienced. That, I think, comes from the novelty of life as you begin versus its mundanity, or, for lack of a better term, suffering as you get older. And that brings in a few different concepts with the existentialists and the rejection of these things that we bring about with the current paradigm that we're existing under in our current moment, in our relative space in the world. And whatever you want to call them, the cathedral or whatnot, have this distinct destruction of these ideas in mind, that this transhumanist perspective of anti-aging, immortality, end of history type of deal, beginning with no end, as we are describing, but within that beginning and no end type of scenario that doesn't make sense within how the order of the universe would necessarily need to be structured. And so they're trying to defy these implicit realities for whatever reasons that they might have, and that's a interesting examination thereof too, and then how it affects everyone on a societal level. But we'll get to that in a moment. That idea I had, though, with the novelty versus mundanity seems to be that the more novel experiences you have, the less, I don't want to say habitual, but the less regimented that your life is, the slower it goes by. And I've made that I've made those observations myself and how I've personally perceived time. Whereas, say I'm in school as a younger kid, and the school year starts to quicken as it gets closer to the end, because I've gotten to a rhythm of things with my classes, the people I have in my class, and so on. But at the beginning, it's all very new. That first week of school is very long and daunting, and there's a whole new teachers and faces or people, or a whole new school even entirely. And in my travels to other places, or in my experiences in learning new things, always starting off in the novelty of the thing, that the brand new vitality of whatever is new to me, will always be a much slower process going on. And then until I get into the rhythm of things, then that's when things start to speed up and quicken up, and it doesn't seem like a slog necessarily, as many things do in the beginning, because it's harder to first grapple with these new concepts.
Yeah.
But going further into things, you almost get a skill in it. But if you keep things just varied enough, then it seems like there's a stability in how time operates, and life doesn't just fly by you. And I think that's the trap that's sort of hurt so many people in our modern age, going back well before any of us were born, because that kind of gets into that concept of the end of history mentality of these neoliberal actors, the cathedral, as it were, trying to construct society around, which brings up...
Well, wait, before you get into anything, I was looking up something that you, as you were talking, it reminded me of. There was actually a proven study. I can't remember who did it, but I wanted to get this in there. You know, the idea of time that you were saying, like how the end of the year feels like it's a lot shorter than the beginning of the year. You know what I mean? There's this idea. So I remember feeling the exact same way when I was in school. You know, elementary school felt like a day took forever, right? And then when I got into middle school, it felt like a day went by super quick. And then middle school kind of dragged on a little bit. And then when I got to high school, it felt like the day was even faster. And then by the time I was, senior year of high school, the day felt like it started and ended, and it was really quick. And I thought that was just me. So I looked up this one time when I was in middle school. There was this study that happened. I just can't remember. I can't find it now. But there's a study that kind of went into the psychology of the perception of time, and it showed, it kind of explained it like this. Imagine a toddler lives a day. That whole day is his whole life. Or a baby lives a day. A newborn baby lives a day. That day is his whole life. And then he lives another day. Well, that day is now half his life. And so it was only half as long for him. Then the next day is 1/3 of his life. And so that day is 1/3 as long for him. And so obviously you keep going on and you keep adding more days to his life, and they keep dividing his life. So the next, you come up to a year-old baby, and his first birthday is only 1/365th of his life. So he experiences it in a much shorter time period than he would have understood himself experiencing the day he was being born. That's kind of the way that that kind of relates to the idea that you were bringing up too. 1 year, if we just extend the time period, in elementary school, let's say you're 5th grade, you're like 10, 11, 12, whatever it may be. 1 year, let's just say 10, is 1/10 of your life. So that year feels like it takes up 1/10 of your life, because it did. But the next year is 1/11th of your life. And then the next year is 1/12th of your life. And so these years get shorter and shorter. So where you may feel like you would have grown up really slowly, for an adult, they experienced you growing up super quickly, because it was only maybe 10/45ths of their life. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the old saying, "Oh, they grow up so fast."
Yeah, it's they grow up in the same amount of time. It's just your experience of the time in relation to the time you've been alive is a lot different. So that's kind of what I wanted to segue in there while you were talking.
I think that's a good way of looking at it as well. It not the whole picture, and I don't think my conception is the whole picture either, but maybe a fusion plus some other things that we might be missing is a good way to figure out exactly how time is perceived, especially with maybe a more hyperbolic step in how, like a step function, if you guys know what mathematics, in how time is perceived across your different brain development. Like as a baby, the what's it called? Object permanence is almost non-existent. So even in that day that's perceived as their entire life, it's almost forgotten about by the next hour. Whole different weird stuff, and so that could be a whole discussion in itself. If we can get like a physicist and a psychologist and a neurologist on, I might know a couple. I'll ask around, and that could be a very interesting discussion in and of itself. But
I feel like that would be enlightening.
Back to it,
yeah,
very much so. Getting back to it though, I was gonna say, I was bringing up John J. Calhoun's or B. Calhoun. One sec, I myself to that higher standard of exactly how to pronounce his name.
I fall flat of that too myself sometimes.
John B. Calhoun, and his Mouse Utopia experiment. I'm sure many of you are aware of what this experiment is. It exploded in popularity around 2015, 2016. Maybe 2017 is when it peaked, and how many people have reinvestigated this idea and his discoveries back in the 60s. And that question really comes back to is what happens when we have no higher purpose in life, like this Nietzschean conception of nihilism, but all of our material needs are sufficient. And Kaczynski kind of brings this up in his writings as well, and how these two things clash with our anxieties and our psychologies as individuals and as entire societies. And so we're seeing the process now of the consequences of those things, and it's disastrous. And that's why this sort of end of history mentality type of paradigm that's occurring has had such drastic, like horrific effects beyond that of which history has known. I mean, war and change and all these other things that have happened have all been horrific sort of cataclysmic events that have occurred throughout human history, the rise and fall of civilizations, but nothing as existentially concerning as this very robotic, synthetic type of existence that we all live now in the modern age. And that's not all to do with technology, even though my vocabulary is kind of hinting at that. It's more to do with how alienated we've become with our own natures, and that's what we're trying to
understand, I guess, is a good way of
not understand, but complement is the closest word I'm getting at, but not quite the one I want. But to complement those two realities with each other, and then move forward from that, and hopefully move away from this Kali Yuga that we're living in.
Yeah.
And so that question I'll ask again is what happens when we're stripped of all these higher, almost religious pursuits and purposes, and then from that, all of our material needs are more or less sufficient, even though we might have strife here and there, or stress pressed upon us over the financial aspect of perpetuating these things. But in historical terms, material needs are of no consequence to us, really. It's more or less first world problems, even for the third world, compared to a historical perspective on things, until you get to like pinnacles of civilization like Rome or whatnot. And even then, that's a whole different perception of reality than what we're dealing with now, like I said, because they had those higher purposes in mind still, even when all their material needs were more or less taken care of by wider society. And so these technological and spiritual questions kind of coming out ahead at the same time has been tearing apart society and even the individual as we know it. And that's where I think the existentialism of the day really comes down to it, and why figures like Jordan Peterson have been thrown into such a superstardom like rise. And it's what we're hoping to help answer now too, and how to actualize those behaviors that might all help us move towards this cure to the modern age.
Yeah. And what's funny is you said that here these questions we're trying to answer, and here I was just thinking, like, we might ask more questions here than we answer.
That's always the case in any of the philosophies or scientific pursuits. In one question that you may successfully answer, you will have 10 new ones that will be open-ended, and that's just our mortal existences coming up against the immortal infinity of reality.
Yeah. But what you're bringing up kind of goes into the topic of consciousness. I watched a good video in preparation for this episode as well. You remember the scientific channel Vsauce, right? It was all over the place in like the 2010s, early 2010s.
They still make videos, and I still
partake
in watching a few. Oh, yeah.
I didn't know that. I remember that he went paid, and so I had to stop. But
I see.
Yeah, regardless, he posted a video about 10 years ago, the main Vsauce channel, and it had to do with consciousness. And the questions he asked within it the questions he asked are, to what degree are you yourself? And he gave the example, I guess he gave the little tidbit of information that scientists cannot truly define what consciousness is, and they can't identify it. Obviously, they can see it when it happens. They intuitively know, but they can't quantify it. It's only a certain quality. Sentience is within the same regard. But he gave the example, let's say, you and I, one by one, transferred the atoms in my brain over to the atoms in yours, and the atoms from your brain over to the atoms in mine. He asked the question, to what degree am I you and are you me? Will we ever be able to know each other's thoughts? Or to what degree are we experiencing life from both perspectives? And the question, I had this question when I was a kid because, I was into things like, science fiction and all that stuff. And I remember asking, how would teleportation work? I would ask that to my grandpa, who was he was in the sciences himself. I can't remember what exactly it was he did, but he said, well, one of the main ways that they try to depict it is by breaking down all the atoms within you and then building them back up somewhere else. And my question to that was, okay, if I am teleported from here to there through that manner, to what degree am I myself there? Don't I just die and then whoever is built up over there?
That exact question has been a debate in philosophic and scientific circles for decades, especially around popular culture mediums like Star Trek and their teleporters. And I actually had a opportunity to debate that exact topic in my Introduction to Logic course that I took when I was younger. It was a special summer program thing for talented and gifted youths that I'm not going to be a braggart about, but it was an experience I had to be able to do. And what was interesting there is that even though there was a pro and a con side to that, and if that would actually be you, that disintegrating of a person and then reconstructing it there, we didn't have any real definitive answer because, well, medically looking at it, yeah, you'd be dead for whatever length of time, however minute that would be, in essence, when you were disintegrated. And then when you were reconstructed, okay, that might be you, quote unquote, but that's just a reconstruction of you. That's a replica. It's almost like a clone, and it exacts atomic clone, which is weird. And that even predates even further to something like the ship of Theseus, which I'm sure many people know from any introduction to paradoxes or infinities and things like that.
Yeah.
Another course I took alongside that logic course. And that has a whole bunch of different implications there, as well as, okay, when you start replacing bits and parts, when does the old thing continue to be that thing if there's a whole replica of the original pieces that was made, since you've replaced all the parts with new parts?
Right.
And how does that translate to a human consciousness, which is even more complex? And no one really has a good answer for those questions because there are limits to our quantitative understanding of reality, which is why I stress so much that this scientism of the New Age is a very dangerous secular religion for people to be following, because it is hyper fixating on this material worldview when there are questions that our ancestors have been struggling with since the dawn of mankind that we have not had answers to, and we've only gotten a little closer in all of humanity's time on Earth to figuring these things out. And in the last 2 centuries or so, we've only gotten further away for rejecting all of the ancient wisdoms of our ancestors on these existential questions that we know for a fact the sciences can't explain, and consciousness being one of the biggest ones. I believe there was an experiment in the 1910s with some physician. I'm struggling to remember the sources on it, but they were trying to measure the human soul at the time of death, and there was a very intricately balanced scale that was used to weigh a person as they were on their deathbed, quite literally, like terminal patients that are comatose and so on and so forth, that were breathing their last breaths. And as that happened, there was some shift, some slight change, where in the moment they died, their bodies got lighter for a moment. And they recorded these changes over and over again. It happened as every single person died, and there was no real understanding on how that could be, on what was going on in that process. And the theory was that, well, human beings actually have some soul that departs from our body when we die, and that's the end of our consciousness right there. Or it manifesting into a new state because our physical state has reached its limit. And so this metaphysical state is now going somewhere or sometime or some other else. And that's something that the sciences may only just scratch the surface on, but could never actually know.
Yeah, and as you get into it, as you start to understand, like, it took me a long time to be able to grasp the idea of holism and understanding that these things are various, like, these things are interrelatable in a way in which we might not experience them because we are experiencing just one branch of a larger principle. And so, in the sense that when you die, you go sometime else. It doesn't make sense speaking it, but it makes sense if you intuitively know. You know what I mean? And that kind of gets into the different types of knowledge that I was gonna outline as well, because the Greeks had three different types of knowledge. They had gnosis, episteme, and there was one more, doxa, or doxa, however you would say it. Yeah, there's doxa, episteme, and gnosis, and it's this. There are three different degrees to which these knowledges can be understood. Doxa, that first type of knowledge, is essentially what you would know because someone has told you about it. It's essentially the article I have here compares it to hearsay, and that is true. Doxa is kind of like a subordinated form of knowledge that is only knowledge because you have no alternative to counter it, and that's been what that's what you have been told about, or what you have experienced in a vacuum, if that makes sense. And then episteme is the second form of knowledge, and that's what we mostly mean when we talk about knowledge. We reference knowledge as logical knowledge, or experiential knowledge, or reasonable or rational knowledge. That all falls into the category of episteme. And then gnosis, we talked about this before, I believe, but not really that in depth. Gnosis is like the last, it's like the highest form of knowledge. It's not knowledge because you, it's not knowledge because you've learned it. It's not knowledge because you've heard it or reasoned it out, or have thought about it. It's an intuition. It's an intuitive type of knowledge. And so gnosis is that last little bit. And this kind of corresponds to an idea that I haven't heard much talk on, but it's this other type of knowing that comes from sensory details as well. So, like, you can see something so you know it, or you can feel something so you know it. But then there's that other emotional or conscious level of feeling or seeing, and then there's that last level, that last internal level of simply knowing. That would be gnosis. It's that last, most abstract level of knowledge that you just intuitively know about something, in the same way that you intuitively know that you exist. It's
I was just going to say, it goes back to the "I think, therefore I am" of Descartes.
Yeah, it's an unquantifiable type of knowledge, and that's it. All of this conversation kind of goes back to the same general idea. Is what we're trying to get at is that the questions we're trying to answer with these different categorizations, or different, even what's it called? Different qualities about reality that we're trying to emphasize and bring forth. The questions that we're trying to answer is, to what degree does existence exist? How would it exist? And then what can we learn about it so that we can apply in our lives.
And just as an aside, it is Duncan MacDougall who ran that experiment in 1907-ish on the weight of the soul. And the published weight actually is about 21 grams, which inspired a movie in 2003 by the same name.
I think I have heard of his name. That does sound like a familiar experiment. And it's funny to think that the soul might actually have a little bit of weight to it, that it might be like a physical entity.
Yeah. But it was kind of like universally condemned and discredited among the scientific community, as most explorations into the, I wouldn't necessarily say occult, but supernatural are to go. But considering that human flight would have been considered supernatural 2 centuries ago, it like, come on now.
Yeah, there's a possibility there. But I guess one last thing I wanted to talk about. Have you kind of exhausted everything on your list as well?
No, the existentialism in art, and then
oh yes, okay,
the faking it till you make it aspects of things as well.
Okay. This was the last thing on my list, and then we can get into that. Was the idea of property and ownership. Was this last little bit of segment that I wanted to talk about, because there's this idea of that a person, as he exists within himself, takes ownership of his own actions, his own thoughts, and then there's that relative element within him that does not kind of belong to him. There's kind of like an other. So there's this idea in Native American culture, which has been expounded upon now in contemporary culture and kind of vandalized or bastardized, which is the idea of someone being two-spirit, or of dualism. And this kind of plays into the idea of property by property and ownership as well, by you kind of sharing ownership of your body with something that is not entirely you. And it kind of comes into the mind, body, soul triad as well. There's the idea of you being made of 3 different parts, obviously the mind, the body, and the soul. There's also other ideas of a person existing as a triad or trifecta type of entity, where there's the force that is the soul of the person, there's the spirit of the person, and then there's what proceeds from the soul once the person dies. And what you were talking about with that experiment kind of actually reminded me of this concept. There's this idea that a person is, I can't remember the exact words of what it would be called. So soul and spirit are the 2 like general terms that are applied in this sense. And then the third one would be called like the shadow. But there's specific terms for them within various religious codes, and especially within Native American ones that share the idea of a person having multiple elements to them. But there's this idea of a person existing as a conscious entity. The soul would be the idea of what is conscious and what you take ownership of, and the actions in which you partake. Then there's the idea of the spirit, which is the generative aspect of a person, which is, it kind of produces the soul. It kind of works in tandem with it, but it is the precursor to the soul, and then it is the absorbative entity of the soul once it dies. So the shadow goes back into the spirit. But this idea of ownership, and of especially ownership within existentialism, is this idea that is the kind of corresponds to the idea of control. We talked a little bit about how a person might reflect the monad by having different levels of relativity to his mind, and how the monad has different levels of relativity to it as well. And we talk about ownership and property and things like that as belonging to a certain person. What I'm trying to get at is there is a degree to which you have ownership over yourself, but that ownership only extends as far as you can keep it. That there's that idea extends also into like politics and political thought as well, where you have the right to whatever you can defend and things like that. But this idea is a little bit more abstract in the sense that there are some things which pop up in a person's consciousness over which they cannot take ownership. And this is most commonly found, in things like mental diseases like dementia and things like that, where you cannot really control it. And so the question being asked here is, to what degree do you have ownership over things within you? And then to what degree are you able to exact that ownership over things without you? And then do certain ontological statuses change if you own certain things within the world and if you own certain things within yourself?
That's a bit where I wanted to go to, which was a third aspect of things that we didn't get, was free will a bit in that Calhoun Mouse Utopia example, because it brings up a bit on Edward Bernays' construction of society under propaganda and the fourth estate sort of guidance of public perception, and how that has been the modus operandi of our current political and financial structure, if you could even really call any of those things that. And it's very much dependent on utilizing those aspects of psychology that could be manipulated on an individual and on a mass scale to have the populations of any place, whether it be the United States or China or wherever, and get them to go along with a certain thing, or to, and how marketing goes by a certain product. And that's what marketing firms and advertisements do. They all kind of go off the research of Bernays and some of his contemporaries. I'm forgetting their names right now, but there was more than just Edward Bernays at the time of his published works that were coming out with the same concepts. And there are many in the scientific community, both as biologists, evolutionary biologists, physicists, and so on, that strongly believe that there is no such thing as free will at all. And as you could guess, all of them are atheists, sort of materialists, that are looking at things only in the chemical processes going on in our brains and how those things might be manipulated. But what they often ignore is the spontaneity of things that go well beyond any blood memory of ancestral genetic imprint that's been passed down to us that will affect how we operate in society, which is what a lot of the evolutionary biologists believe in rejecting free will, or in whatever chemical processes might be going on that are offensive or productive to our sensory organs, which is a lot what the other types of biologists and things might be considered the limitations of our free will. And that's in some of these metaphysical concepts like we're talking about, but most so in the expression of art and in what we can conceive with art and beauty and horror, really, in the world. And three figures that really exemplify these sort of existential questions are Dostoevsky, H.R. Geiger, and this name is always very difficult to pronounce. He's a Polish artist by the name of Władysław Beksinski. Might have just butchered that. If it's Zdzislaw Beksinski, if you want to look him up yourself. Both him and Geiger, very influential artists throughout the 70s and 80s. Geiger's work you might be most familiar with is in the Alien franchise, and the actual Alien itself being very much derived from his work. So those three, I think, would be a good topic to get into. Vincent, you had some things to say about Dostoevsky specifically?
Yeah, going back a little bit to what you were talking about, though, with the propaganda and propaganda and people's mindsets, that really does kind of emphasize the relative aspect of people's minds, and it kind of it's what sets them apart from that greater and lesser individual that I keep bringing up. The greater individual is someone who has kind of fully manifested themselves as an individual, whereas the lesser individual is someone who kind of relies on absorption. The lesser individual is kind of like a sponge, where he absorbs all of these various influences from society within it, like into his character, and that way his character is expressed through the material which he absorbed. It's kind of like how a sponge is soapy when you get soap on it, but once you remove the soap, it's still just a sponge. Now it has water in it. The lesser individual is kind of like that, like the uninitiated, masses, that common caste type of individual who has not yet risen in or not intelligibility, but intuition. Someone who has not reached that last little step that they need to take into a wider world of understanding who they are and existing as they are. And that kind of gets into what we were talking about last episode in the mythology aspect of having the masses get absorbed back into the totem, while the greater or lesser, or the greater individual stands out among his own lineage. But what you were talking about kind of reminds me of that, with the propaganda being kind of a necessity almost for the masses to get them to conform to something, that to get to kind of fill the gaps in that relative aspect of the brain, or that relative part of the mind, that we keep referring back to. It fills the gaps in there, and this can be a tool that is used either for great good or great evil, and most of the time it is a great evil. But
yeah, well, at least in our modern sense, there's I think it was Italian Ganon's protege.
Oh, Evola?
Evola, thank you. Sorry, don't know why I forgot his name for a second. I believe it was Evola who called the masses a sack of potatoes malleable to the malleable to a push. Yeah. And a proper elite, or the proper rulers over society, need to push and pull the masses as needed for their own benefit and for ours. And it's a bit in that way, like you were saying, could be used for good and for evil. But there's only really recently that it's been used for evil in such an extent. I mean, having us live through our current time period, yeah, we say that the ills that we're experiencing in real time are the most evil, maybe playing up that drama a little bit. I'm sure those throughout history experiencing the oppression of the opposed classes, or the ruling elite that they're trying to depose themselves for whatever ideological or religious reasons, might feel the same way.
Yeah.
We're getting at some of the more nefarious aspects of why it is that these people aren't just adversaries or enemies to be overcome, but are just putridly evil for these existentially harmful reasons. And a lot of that is depicted through what we were going to get on with the art, and why it kind of defies this rejection of free will that's being generated by this class of scientism, and utilized, at least philosophically, by these transhumanist types that do try to run things. Right. And three of them we mentioned were Linsky, no, Beksinski. Hard name to pronounce.
Yes, it is.
Beksinski, Geiger, and Dostoevsky. And I asked before if you wanted to get into Dostoevsky, and you went on the other part. What was it? specifically now for
Oh,
Dostoevsky?
yeah, I went into the whole propaganda thing and the relative aspect of the mind, but I actually did want to touch upon Dostoevsky as like an intellect because he stands out among others by by being one of the few among his time, especially post Enlightenment period, that doesn't get drawn into too much of a political dogma. Obviously, he was a an Orthodox Christian, so he did have that religious aspect about him. But that's what probably separated him from the masses at the time, is that he did subscribe to a higher set of ideas. And so, even though he was part of a few groups in Russia who tried to even the playing field a bit between the different classes, it was almost something that was necessitated, and it was not so much an anti-traditional revolution like most of the third estate revolutions are, but it was more so a upwards oriented unification effort for Russia in its entirety. And so it's very interesting when you contrast his ideas with the Enlightenment ideas that were popular at the time, propagated by John Locke and most famously him, Rousseau, and the other guy, Voltaire, because they were, while they might not have been secularists themselves, they were like the forefathers of secularism, especially in the West. And so it was funny because Dostoevsky he did kind of call himself a traditionalist, even though he did advocate for a certain amount of progress, not in the way that it's used today, but an amount of progress out of the situation that was Russia in the 19th century. And so it's cool to kind of learn about how he rejected the Western involution of ideas and try to go in his own separate way. And he even tried to establish a kind of Slavic identity apart from the rest of Europe and the rest of the West, which I think maybe due to his efforts or maybe due to the efforts of him and his contemporaries, he actually kind of succeeded in that regard. And yeah, I just find him an interesting figure. But there was something you wanted to mention about him?
I liken him most to like a Russian Edgar Allan Poe, because I think Poe predates him by not that much time, but they still very much were contemporaries, at least stylistically and in mood as well. Although I think Poe might have been a bit more dramatized in his despair. Dostoevsky, being a typical Russian, is just steeped in the absolute misery of the world coming. And he, in this sort of enlightened vision that he had, that Vincent was talking about, very much saw the coming revolution of the October Revolution and Lenin and everything else. Even though his writings predated all of that happening by decades, he still understood that these were the moving tides, and him keeping his ear close to the ground in the people of Russia and their contempts or their struggles, or the respects and disrespects between the different classes of people through this changing of the century and this changing tide of industry and of geographical power in the regions across Europe and everything that's going on in the wider world. And he definitely strikes to that vision that ironically enough seemed more hopeful for the future than what came about. And that's a bit in how it embodies this genuine free will, this free spirit. And those materialists that reject this will altogether might be onto something for a certain class of people. It's that free will is genuinely come about when you have an understanding beyond yourself and not just your creature comforts. Like I keep calling back to the Mouse Utopia experiment. It's because so many in society are cattle-like in just going about their day, and if they were an actual animal, just grazing and eating and surviving until they keel over, because there's no higher thought going about them. And that's not to be disrespectful in any way to the masses in general, but it's just kind of the hard truth and reality of it, like we mentioned with the Evola quote, the sack of potatoes, and they just need directionality, but that's been more or less taken away, and so now it's this general aimlessness, and that's why there's so much of this existential lashing out, whether it be in causing havoc in cities with protests, trying to be part of some wider movement to give themselves a purpose for some preconceived or completely fabricated struggle that they're trying to resist, at least in the mind of the individual person doing that, not on the people higher up orchestrating these things for political maneuvering, or in getting together with these not necessarily hobbies. I forget the exact word Kaczynski used for them. Surrogate activities.
Yeah, surrogate
there
activities.
We go. And trying to propagate yourself in that manner as to more or less occupy yourself and distract yourself from the woes and suffering that is implicit with the nature of life, which is what the existentialists get at. And that expression of that despair and the overcoming of it is the point I was trying to make with Dostoevsky, and then moving on to the other artists, is that reflection that transcends just instincts or blood memory or anything of the sort reacting to stimuli, and that's the supposed free will under the guise of scientism, because there is no rhyme or reason or purpose on a biological imperative to do such things, to make art in any sense. But not only that, to really, I want to say, wallow in the darkest aspects of the human experience in the first place, because those would be detrimental to our health, physically, mentally, and spiritually overall, but necessary aspects of life that we all experience anyway. And so being able to willingly go into that unknown and brave it, go into that dark and fearful perception or area or adversary, and do that by will, either to overcome it or to understand it, is a remarkable aspect of that genuine free will that exists, or has the potential to exist across all of mankind, but usually doesn't manifest because there is no guidance for the masses in order to manifest that ability. And it's these select few people throughout history, this minority that impose their will then on the rest of society, and that's why their names are remembered, because they've been this guiding force for the better or for the worse, and everyone else kind of has to keep up with that, or a new set of elites come around to challenge that. And we might be in that time period now, especially with current events unfolding with Elon Musk and Twitter and these mega corporations like Vanguard and stuff, but we keep the rank punditry to a minimum here.
You mentioned quite a bit of stuff, so kind of going back to what you were talking about with the idea of choice and stuff like that, and how you're talking about the idea that you don't have a choice, being a purely materialistic worldview. And I actually heard a worldview, or I actually heard not a theory, but I guess a theory, where if you knew every position and trajectory of every atom in the universe, theoretically you could predict the future. That was the idea. And maybe on a physical level, maybe. But I don't think that takes into account a lot of the stuff, like how we were talking about consciousness and everything like that. It doesn't add up in that regard. But it was.
You know what's the funny thing about that, though? Is theoretically, the pure hypothetical concept of that maybe could work in a sense if you're looking at it from a completely material point of view. The crazy thing is, though, that even under that materialistic understanding, when you have an observation of these atoms in and of themselves, the act of viewing them changes their course and trajectory and velocity and all that as well, because you're bouncing photons off of these subatomic particles that has just enough force, because it's working with such small quantities, that it knocks it off course, and it changes their projection, their projected direction or vector, as you will.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that's the paradox about it, because like you're saying, like if theoretically you could see all of it and where they're going, you might be able to predict the future. But in seeing them, that changes where they're going in the first place. So it's almost kind of like a biblical biting the fruit off the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because, well, now you can make those decisions, and now everything gets ruined, because where you were going has completely dissolved, and now there's a whole new reality just from the fact that you know what was. It's a very weird way to think about it, but if you can wrap your heads around it, it's kind of true in a sense, in both the material and spiritual realm.
Right. It is interesting, because what you were talking about, it kind of leads into my kind of response to that, which was that in a sense, yes, and in a sense, no, because the atoms depict only one aspect of reality. The atoms themselves are more or less expressions or symbols for various forces, the trajectories themselves, and the trajectories themselves are the same thing. So it's really that relative aspect of reality that I was talking about, way in the beginning, as the monad kind of enters within itself and has these different degrees to it. The atoms represent almost the lowest part of that, that scale, or not scale, but that set of degrees. So the idea that you could look upon these and predict the future almost seems unreal. And that's probably why it's impossible. You know what I mean? So
there's a certain hubris to it that makes it seem laughable at the face of it, because it's something really, truly only God, or a God, any person's conception of the monad or the divine would be able to do.
Yeah,
and
it's the impossibility.
Anything outside of that, well, I guess impossible outside of that sense.
Yeah.
And anyone conceivably trying or I guess hypothesizing to do that has that level of hubris that is likened to a story like the Tower of Babel and whatnot. It's that reaching beyond what we should be naturally capable of, and it'll only lead to our own destruction.
But the other thing you mentioned was the idea of art and the kind of rationality to it. And I believe it was somewhere in the doctrine even that we put that kind of our stance on rationality or rationalism, and the idea of a rational order to humanity. And one of those things, one of the arguments against rationalism and empiricism, by the way, it's not just because there's that false dichotomy as well between empiricism and rationalism. But the response that a lot of people, a lot of metaphysicians and we ourselves have given to the idea of human rationalism and human rationality is the idea of celebration or of beauty or of art, things of that sort. Like, why do we celebrate a holiday? That's not rational. It's not productive in any sense to go and celebrate an activity. Why do we make art? That's not productive either. It's not rational. It doesn't have any rational value to it. And the same thing with celebrations and beauty. Why do we place value in things that are beautiful over things that are not? There's no, if beauty is truly subjective in the same sense that rational things need to be taken into consideration, why do we prefer to look at pretty things instead of ugly things. It's that type of idea that humans are not rational creatures, and so celebrating holidays and art are two of the biggest examples even that I've heard against the idea of rationalism and things like that. So it's funny that you bring it
Absolutely.
up in such a way.
Oh, well,
Oh, go ahead.
because that plays, what you said plays into the other two artists I brought up. Pinsky, I always have to pause to make sure I pronounce his name right, and Geiger. And they both express that maybe in unintended ways on what you're describing, because what you are saying is this irrationality to things has always kind of been present in humanity, that this sort of spontaneity that we all have, at least to some degree. And increasingly, there's been a mechanization of that aspect of our lives where we aren't allowed to be as spontaneous or to be as free in movement or thought or in form even. And there needs to be a certain rigid conformity, not in the ways that we were traditionally expected to do so for the benefit of society, but in much more rationalistic, synthetic ways since post-industry, which kind of gets to Kaczynski's argument on things. And that mechanization, this automation and the media automatons that are the normie or the NPC type of archetype of person in society is depicted in such a way in Geiger and in Beksinski's work, because there is this fusion of the organic and the machine in both of their imaginations. That there's this hellish sort of hellscape that they're depicting, both from different tragedies of their lives, two completely different perspectives. One being a person subjected to the Iron Curtain in Poland during the height of the Soviet Union. Another being a sort of tortured artist that had a few different mental issues, but most affected so by the suicide of his first wife that greatly impacted his art. And so these grand and very personal aspects of tragedy and suffering translate then into their artwork. And they're very scary things to look at and observe, and see this melting away of the human and of the organic into this sort of very, I don't even want to call it sterilized, but this mechanized type of environment, even though it looks very hellish, and you'd think of hell as like the fire and brimstone or organic type of place, but it is much more organized to almost a neurotic degree. And you can see that in their artwork and how it's been expressed to depict that. Because like under the Soviet Union, there was many such cases of this over-mechanization for the welfare of the Union and of the pursuit of communism and things like that, even at the expense of the people and the masses. And you can see no better example of that than something like the Battle of Stalingrad, where men, women, children, soldiers, civilians, everyone just gave their lives for the cause over the benefit of the town. And yes, that maybe saved the war in a sense on the Russian side of things, but at an incalculable amount of human life lost, like an entire city wasted essentially, even if the buildings still stood, which half of them weren't, but almost everyone involved in that city who lived there, who fought there, pretty much died in fending off the German invasion. And it's something like that sort of disregard for the human life in this grand system in its entirety is reflected much in Beksinski's work, and what people like Jordan Peterson touches upon very much in this dichotomy, or this false dichotomy that he puts it, between nihilism and these very radical ideologies and elements to resist the mundanity of this over mechanized lifestyle of our postmodern age.
Yeah. Um, you mentioned a false dichotomy between nihilism and the ideologies. What do you mean?
So, as Peterson puts it, there's the this existential crisis of the modern man, where uh, we ask ourselves, what is the meaning of our own lives? And how do we deal with the implicit dread and trauma and suffering that goes along with it, no matter um, how enjoyable or pleasant the moment that we exist in may be, overarching the span of our lives, we will face unimaginable hardships and loss and tragedy and so on and so forth, most of the time completely outside of our control. And so it's the question of how do we deal with that and keep moving forward past that, when at times for the rationalist perspective of things, it would make sense to just end it all because then there would be no more suffering. It's kind of like it's where the natural conclusion goes towards nihilism, and then you have that nothingness in its truest sense. There is no reason or rhyme to live, despite everything being broken down to its most calculable parts. And then on the other side of that, it's taking it away from the individualized personal tragedy of things, moving on to the grand scheme of things with vast totalitarian ideologies like fascism or communism or whatever other ism you might think of. And liberalism is all the same in that respect, where they are very much totalitarian forms of thought meant to organize the entire, not even just society, but globe around this way of thinking. And everything has to come down to be moving parts of the system. Otherwise, it is a threat to the system overall. And that crushes that individual aspect of things. And it might get rid of the personal existential dread because there's some artificial greater experience to uh, invest yourself into, that the state with fascism or the proletariat with communism or air quote democracy with liberalism or whatever flavor of ideology you want to give it. But then no actual substantive problems get solved because it's all in the pursuit of faux goals that these ideologies prop themselves up with. And that's Peterson's sort of his depiction of the world as we have it now, and why we have such stark political divides, from his perspective, and why we have such stark rates of depression and suicide and hopelessness on the individual who don't subscribe to those deeply radicalized political divisions.
That's interesting. That's interesting how he phrases that. Because I've had the same idea. I don't know if he calls it a false dichotomy as you do, but I haven't heard any of his stuff. I might have to look him up just so I can familiarize myself with what he thinks. But the idea of nihilism and ideology, I guess, is a good way of putting the dichotomy of the way modern man sees existence and purpose. Because especially that is a good way of putting it. Wow. I'm still kind of absorbing it, but you mentioned that how everything in the sense of an ideology has to be done in favor of the set of ideas being carried out, in a sense, right? So you mentioned like meaning isn't, meaning is entirely ideological, right? So it would be like you find your purpose through like the proletariat, like you said, or like through the state, or through some other type of material manifestation of a certain principle, not necessarily through actual meaning or through the purpose itself, the principle itself, but more so through carrying it out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I could see why.
I I could see like through the screen right now you wrestling with these concepts, and I again I'm just paraphrasing Peterson and his lectures. I've read his book and followed him for quite a many years now, but I think I did a good job in sort of explaining what he's said many a times. But yeah, I can understand you now going like, huh, never thought about it like that.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And then there's that third dimension as well, because these ideologies themselves come about at a time in the Kali Yuga. They come about at a time when there is only mechanization, or how would you put it? There is only
numericized
the reign of quantity, and atomization and things like that. So they're kind of capitalizing on this. We did talk about this with the economic ideology episode, and these are really economic ideologies at their very core. It's just the organizing of economic institutions, and that in itself is a material pursuit. So no matter which one of these ideologies under the banner of the third estate that you subscribe to, it still is a materialistic worldview in at its core. But it's
almost like it's all controlled opposition from this sort of proverbial egg that they all hatched from. And these ideologies or these competing elites or whomsoever foot soldiers fighting each other in the streets, they might not see it that way, but when you zoom out and compare it to the rest of history as we know it, it's very much that sort of mechanization that they all stem from, and this devolution that they all are going down the road of.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of tragedy of it, because they, as evil as we might declare some ideologies over the other and what we want to do with it, they all want to try and solve some of these problems. But then they end up making 1,000 more in the solution or pursuit of a solution for one of them. Or they've drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak, so much so that even when the problem isn't there anymore, let's say it was solved or it was misunderstood to have been a problem in the first place, they've been so radicalized in the pursuit of these goals that they must fight this phantom enemy or this phantom issue that's plaguing society, regardless of the consequences of their actions as a consequence.
Right.
And even when there's a fundamental misunderstanding or an outright denial of reality in the pursuit of fixing these problems, it's the radicalized element that brought these people together to do so in the first place that is going to keep them going at it, because if they drop that, realistically they have nothing else in their lives to keep going for.
Oh, you mentioned you mentioned how like each of these ideologies have an enemy, and it's true. If you look at especially post third estate revolution ideologies such as communism, liberalism, fascism, all of these 19th and 20th century economic ideologies that came out of the more materialistic and common caste revolutions of the Enlightenment period and the post Enlightenment period. If you look at this, if you look at these as a holistic system, you'll find that there's always an enemy. For the liberals, it was always authority. For the communists, it was always the capitalists or the rich. And in most extreme cases, you see for Nazism, you see it's the Jews, right? So it's all of these have these ideological opponents off of which they base their advocation for certain things. And it's almost like how, you know how I described that lesser type of individual who's like a sponge, who relies on the materials around him to identify himself with. It's almost that on a massive ideological scale, where, excuse me, you have an ideology which defines itself on the basis of what it opposes versus what it is for. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it that actually kind of calls back to the example of a toddler being brought in the mall, and it likens itself to a solution of sorts against this, where it's like exposure therapy. Something that you're exposed to that you're fearful of might be the cure in releasing that fear or phobia or anxiety over that thing in the first place. And it's more or less willingly going into that unknown, like we said, with the artists subjecting themselves to relive these pains and whatnot, by having that vitality of the human experience, however dark it may be, it's still so in-depthly human. Being able to do that little by little throughout your life is what's able to overcome these things. And Piaget kind of talks about this in being able to go outside your comfort zone bit by bit, and you're, say, dropped in a new place, mostly foreign to you, but you'll have sort of instinctual ways, like your body and brain activates in different ways to adapt to those circumstances and make anew. If the change is too radical, then it's kind of the sink or swim type of deal, and you'll either just scrape by and maybe get to it, but most people would sink and kind of drown in the mess of this new frontier that they're in, whether it be a new country or time or even something wholly different entirely that we can't put into words at the moment. It's doing those things by a smaller degree that will keep you sharp and fit, but also give you perspective and wisdom on a lot of things too, which is what we try to do with Praxism as well, and incorporating all of the different perennial ideas and forming them into this direction that points us all in the right direction, this upwards orientation, so that we're not just stuck as the toddler in the shopping mall because our parents walked too far away, and now we're crying because our lifeline has been disconnected from us. It's more of true independence, like a not like a hermit and becoming a woodsman and kind of living out in the trees, but of a sort of Robin Hood like character, if you will, calling back to the myths and legends episode.
Yeah.
Where we can embody this archetype of true independence and even maybe even a little bit of spirituality, like a King Arthurian type, and lead not only ourselves, but our closest allies, friends, family, nation, and neighbors, so that it isn't getting trapped by strong men who wish to use their powers for evil or for their own benefit, and it's not being trapped by aimlessness that has no direction for the masses to go in either. And we're kind of caught in between the two simultaneously in the worst aspects, and there's a rapid need for several dozen Arthurian or Caesarian types to come about to lead not only themselves but micronations for the coming future to be the men among the ruins, so to speak, ahead of all these existential problems currently plaguing us, however materially urgent they are, or however spiritually and metaphysically sort of cancerous they've become in ideological terms.
Yeah. And that kind of segues into probably the last topic that we have to go into today, which is how exactly does this fit into my life? How do we manifest this idea of existence? How do we exist? And this we could probably go on for a whole episode about this, just this topic in general. But
Yeah.
about the active implementation of these various theories or the principles which we've espoused and kind of supported over the past, however long we've been doing this. So how is it that we go about changing ourselves and being this greater individual? How do we exist within existence and truly know? How do we get that gnosis? And as a result of that, how can we be who we truly want to be based on what it is that we know? If that makes sense, it's a very it's an open-ended question, but these various philosophers are one part of an idea that we need to kind of carry ourselves with. It's a worldview, and it's an idea that we need to carry ourselves with day in and day out, and not reject. I guess you could say reject the idea of materialism being the complete idea of the world, the complete manifestation of reality, but more so incorporate these other ideas, this holistic view of reality, understand the idea of propriety and of the various things like alignment, spontaneity, and all of that stuff. Understand it and then put it into effect, put it into play. And this means this could mean very relative things. It could mean just at the very least, I don't want to say being a better person, but really being a better person. And
I have a personal example I can give on how to do it, and also a theory that Vincent and I talked about off call before we started the episode on how to maybe accomplish this as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I may.
Yeah.
So the accomplishing aspect of this, what I was mentioning with PJ before on slowly experiencing or getting outside of your comfort zone to adapt relatively to different situations is a good way to do that. But how do you do that necessarily? In our modern technophilic society, we, especially Zoomers and millennials, have this affliction to our phones and computers and whatnot, and it may be kind of hypocritical considering the medium in which we're speaking to you right now and the medium in which we do all our research and communicate and all this, but it's just the times we live in, so to be. We're in Cthulhu's waters, as it were. That could be used to our advantage. And it's, I almost want to say, socially dangerous to manifest yourself in real life nowadays. Talking to people in real life and setting people off the wrong way because everyone's high-strung and pathological and neurotic. It seems like everyone's out to get at each other. And, I mean, you spend any time driving, especially near the inner city or things like that, you feel that way absolutely.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, we exist in this new medium of online spaces. And how we can do that, especially with the younger generations, we can sort of fake it till you make it, as you were, and construct this idealized form of ourselves and really give it some thought, not just slap on your favorite aesthetic and sort of some archaeo-futuristic vaporwave type of deal. Really think about the foundations of an ideology you want to lead your life with, whether that be something like Christianity or Hinduism or some other type of spirituality that leads you towards some sort of ascendance, and a political philosophy that's not just predicated on this guy's the bad guy, but we're the good guy, and it's this false dichotomy going back and forth like so many of our nations have devolved into with parliamentarian or Republican puppet shows and circuses. And take these other aspects of things, hobbies, ways to actualize your praxis in your real life, and make that a whole personality online, all your various social media accounts, how you speak and how you type and how you post even, and present yourself online, and use that as a sort of building block to gauge where you want to go, because the consequences online aren't as drastic, at least for now. It's getting or gotten in a lot of places to the point where anything done online can have very drastic consequences to your real life too. But while you still can, use that little anonymity of the internet left to actualize this sort of ideal form, this novus civis, as we would put it, and follow those principles to a very stringent degree, like a very strict Protestant in 17th century New England or something like that, and how tight knit they were to their principles. Be like that for this new formation, whether you make it entirely yourself or you're basing it around one of these very ancient and perennial worldviews as well. And don't just seclude yourself, but find a community of people where you can keep these interactions up online, and you should be fine. Just keep a cool head and stick to your principles, because that's what'll get you in the right state of being. I always mention Bertaria and Owen Benjamin and people like that. That's exactly what they're doing, and they're all doing very, very well, financially, spiritually, physically. They're having big, growing families. They're having great times. They're building physical communities, and it all started with that online space where they were kind of LARPing, and everyone makes fun of, that's LARP. Yes, LARP. You're using your imagination in a sense is a good way to bring about these tendencies without coming off as a weirdo in real life, as it were. Because once you LARP enough, like I said, faking it till you make it, it'll start to be sincere. It'll start to be genuine. And I've done that with myself too, and it has really worked. And I don't know. I don't want to keep going on too long with that. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, actually, it's very interesting that you, because we think about the internet and it's such a, it's almost like a vile place. You go on the internet and there's so much toxicity,
unadulterated vitriol.
Yeah, it's a very negative, toxic space, especially places like social media where it is entirely profitable, and the system is entirely built around very short and hot takes, which are very obviously meant to get a wide amount of attention, so they have to be very controversial, no matter what it is, whatever it may be, even if it's not just political, but it could be even as something as mundane as like a like family drama posted online, anything like that. We live in it, like the internet is such a volatile place to go anywhere. But like you said, technology itself isn't what's bad. It's it's humanity's attitude towards technology, the dependence on it, and the materialistic worldview that technology substantiates and increases 1,000-fold. So it's interesting, how you've taken this tool, which is really all it is a tool, and used it or suggested it to be used for a more positive purpose. Like a lot of people on the internet kind of go uncensored. They uncensor themselves. They become very vulgar, very brash, very just all these negative things that we ourselves kind of espouse against and talk against. But doing this in this more positive light, going out there and being not who you are, but who you want to be online, or I guess being who you are because that is who you want to be. If that makes sense, in the sense that it's within the realm of possibility for you to be that. You know what I mean? It's not like a complete falsity or falsehood in a sense where you are making up someone. You are being your future self. You are being the person who it is you want to be. And there's a person that I forget the name of, but I've heard about a person who I can't remember even when he lived, but it was an author, and he wanted to kill himself at 16. He wanted to commit suicide at 16 years old, and it was because he whatever it was, I forget the reason even, but he said that he stopped himself at the last minute because he was killing his future self. And so then from that moment on, he decided, okay, I'm not going to be who I was. I'm going to be who I want to be. And then he went and did it. And he wrote all these books and studied whatever it was he wanted to study. And so I know that there is a lot of people, especially today, who may be more traditionally inclined mentally, but don't actualize it physically. They still might speak in tongues or use a lot of vulgar expressions or profane language and kind of
very lowbrow, low frequency means of communication. The vulgarity that exists not just in something like cursing, but in just actions in general and how we live.
Even as such with like casual clothes or substandard casual clothes, if you know what I mean, like almost a I don't want to say I guess like a too casual idea of style of dress. You know what I mean? Like sweatpants, very baggy sweatshirt with perhaps stains on it, that type of thing. And they might be very, very much traditionally inclined. They might be inclined to be a good person, but they just might not have made that step there to actually fulfill that. That's not to say that they aren't good people. But
I think. Sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I just thought of a way to describe it: clothing of convenience and commodity.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to describe it. Yeah. Clothing of comfort, even. Not willing to dress up for even a special event. Like I knew a dude who didn't even dress up for his graduation. He wore the same white stained T-shirt that he wore all year long, the same baggy pants he wore all year long, same tennis shoes. It's that type of idea. Which, speaking to him, he was a really good guy. He was a nice guy, and he had high ideas for himself and high expectations for himself, but he just didn't actualize it. He didn't put it into practice, and that's kind of an interesting way of going about it online, is because that's really where you can go all out. It's a very extreme place. You can dial it up to 10, and I don't want to say no one's going to criticize you for it, because probably everyone is going to criticize you for it, but that's the fun of it, right? You get to be dialed up to 10 with other people who are in their spheres dialing it up to 10, but you're doing something more productive for yourself. And even if you do get criticized for it, you're taking the criticism and you're building up that barrier of defense. You're building up that capability to take criticism and even hate. One thing a lot of online personalities suffer quite a bit is hate mail and hate messages and things like that. And it's very easy to fall into a kind of depression for that negativity. But a lot of them, the successful ones especially, just wind up outright, ignoring it. They wind up building up this tolerance to it, and then it just doesn't even faze them. So that's another way of going about it as well, is building up this tolerance to the criticism you will receive by being the person it is you want to be. So that's kind of interesting.
It's those last two statements you made with the vitriol of social media coming about and people giving all these negative comments and things. The only people who really focus on such comments anyways are utter narcissists and people who need to be constantly inundated with reinforcement and patted on the back, so to speak, to be the center of attention, much like our celebrity culture is today. And they're the ones that get mentally destroyed when the internet or masses, as it were, the fans start turning on them or attacking them for whatever is perceived as inexcusable behavior and so on. It's these narcissists that really get the raw end of the deal in that regard to this technology. But the people making those vitriolic comments, especially towards people like ourselves, those who want to just ridicule and tear down and critique because everyone's a critic, when it comes to you presenting this, so to speak, LARP or this best image of yourself, it's almost always from a place of envy, and it is one of those psychological aspects that are pointed towards bullying, because there's some deficiency that's being taken out in a negative sense on the people who are not in this deficiency or who have an excess of it, and so it's targeted for attack, and you can take both of those types of people and just disregard them altogether, because as soon as they start exhibiting that type of behavior, you know that there's something fundamentally wrong with them, and the worst you can do is take pity on them for yourself. I mean, like the worst you can do in your own actions is take pity on them. The best is to just ignore them outright.
Yeah, it like you said, it does come from a place of envy and you know, a lot of times when, at the end of the day, you know, when they stop, not that they stop, but they when they close their laptop and they go to bed, they don't think about it again. And so it really is just a one-off comment that people are making, because in the same way that you were using that anonymity to bolster yourself, they are using it because it's an outlet for them, for something that they do in their real life. You know what I mean? Or for some problem that they may be facing. So there's a lot of aspects to it, but the idea of faking it till you make it, even online, it can be transferred over to the real world, and that's eventually the goal, you know. So it's not just go online and be this person, this caricature of someone you may or may not want to be, but actually try to, you know, visualize yourself as that person. One piece of advice that I usually give is, and I've been trying to take it myself, is to, whenever you're going to interact with somebody or do something at all, whether or not it's online, envision yourself as the person receiving the interaction. So like if you're going to send a message, envision yourself receiving it as the other person, and see, ask yourself, is this what I would want to be is this what I would want to be perceived as by this person? So would I want to send this message and be perceived as whatever it is that I would perceive myself as if I were the person receiving the message? A lot of times the answer is no. So envision yourself and take that step back. Envision yourself as on the receiving end of whatever it is you dish out. And that goes for the internet, that goes for real life as well. If you are working and this doesn't just mean that if you are abrasive or obnoxious or something like that, that's what needs to be turned down. Even if a person could be too nice, you know what I mean? They could be too accepting of what it is. And so imagine yourself in the shoes of the person who is berating you, and what their opinion of you might be if you accept too much of this negative behavior without standing up for yourself. And that's another. Go ahead.
Sorry, you can finish.
Envision yourself as the other, envision yourself as the other person watching you receive whatever it is the other person is dishing onto you, and think of how you would react to that. You know, think of what you would think of yourself in that instance, and then react accordingly. So it's that level of holistic understanding that, you know, this episode keeps kind of going back to, and really actualizing it, putting it into play. You know, and it really is envisioning yourself from a third perspective, or from at least a second perspective, as an existential entity within the world. So that's kind of how it relates to all of this.
Yeah, to add on to what Vincent was saying, and then we'll probably wrap it up, is being meek and servile, just as on the other side of it, being braggadocious and narcissistic, have no grounds for respect. And what I was saying with the internet being the place to manifest these ideals, at least of yourself, and of what you want to be, is to set the groundwork for what you should be in real life. It's more or less the testing grounds, because the internet, as we have it for our generations, is kind of the main interface in which we've been interacting with the world. We obviously have to go to school and work and things like that, but people are generally very standoffish when it comes to those things. They're secluded or not to be bothered or things like that. People just want to keep to themselves. And I admit I'm even like that sometimes, but I think that's just because I'm autistic as shit. Just got to get a little lowbrow in there for the comedic aspect of things.
Yeah.
But in all actuality, the internet's just our main interface with life as we've known it, growing up with the internet or growing up alongside the internet and so forth. And that's just the, I don't want to say easiest way, but probably ironically, it would feel the most organic way to reinvent ourselves through our projection onto the internet. And then slowly, once we patent down what we truly want to be, and we've mastered it online, to wean off and distance from the internet entirely and live in that more real life moment, that community that exists around you in your actual surroundings. And that's what we should all be striving towards and to one day hopefully achieve, and maybe even live without the internet entirely, because it, as powerful as a tool it is, there's always the grounds for that corruption and poison to just be opened up again and the floodgates released.
Yeah, it is, and the idea is to be that higher ideal of a person in real life. So whatever tool you use to get there is, I don't want to say all the same, but it as long as it has that effect, it's an all right tool to use, because it is ultimately a positive effect. You're probably going to have a positive effect on whoever it is that's going to be interacting with you, so long as that end goal is the goal you're working towards. So even online, just keep in mind that the goal is to bring it out to real life. Would you say that about wraps it up?
I'd say so.
All right, perfect. In that case, I would like to thank everyone for listening in to today's Praxist Table Talk. We touched upon a few concepts here that seemingly are unrelated or may have a distant relation to one another, but they are all kind of important and play within the same order of ideas that we've suggested for this episode. So I hope it wasn't too far-fetched for some people to maybe grasp the concepts and the ideals here, because we did touch upon quite a few things. But
personally, I think we weave them in quite nicely.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, that about wraps up the conversation for this idea, and we would be interested in hearing any thoughts on the matter in the comment section below, so feel free to speak your mind down there. And if you enjoyed the video, consider giving us a like and subscribing to the channel, where there will be more of this content as fast as we can produce it. If you would like to find out more about Praxism in our group, you can check the description of this video for places where that information is located. Thank you once again, Cody.
It was a pleasure.
My name is Vincent, and thank you once again for joining in to today's Praxist Table Talks.
And as Jordan Peterson would say, clean your damn room, bucko!